The universe, in all its infinite wisdom and cosmic irony, had arranged itself into a delightfully predictable hierarchy. At the apex sat the hegemony of superior beings, a collection of ancient civilizations who had long ago perfected the art of conquest through overwhelming technological superiority and crushing bureaucratic efficiency. They maintained detailed files on every inhabited world within 1,000 light-years, complete with conquest difficulty ratings, resource valuations, and estimated pacification timelines. Earth had earned itself the distinguished classification of Class 7 primitive backwater, after extensive surveillance revealed a species that spent its time creating moving pictures of small felines performing acrobatic feats, and engaging in heated debates about the acceptability of tropical fruit on circular bread covered in fermented dairy products. The Hegemony's xenosociologists had filed their report with barely concealed amusement. These creatures clearly lacked the mental capacity for organized resistance. The conquest planning session proceeded with the methodical precision that had subjugated 47 civilizations across 3 galactic arms. The Hegemony's military strategists fed Earth's communications intercepts into their quantum war computers, which promptly calculated a 99.7% probability of successful conquest within 72 standard hours. The remaining 0.3% margin of error was attributed to potential equipment malfunctions, not actual resistance from the inhabitants. The invasion fleet commander reviewed the data with the weary satisfaction of someone who had performed this routine 47 times before. Humanity's military capabilities appeared laughably primitive: chemical propellants, metallic projectiles, and explosive devices that would have impressed his ancestors 10,000 years ago. Their global communication network seemed primarily dedicated to sharing images of food and expressing outrage about the personal lives of individuals whose sole qualification for attention was their willingness to humiliate themselves publicly. The war computers recommended a minimal invasion force of exactly 12 ships, based on historical precedent and efficiency protocols. Previous Class 7 conquests had required an average of 8.3 vessels, but the computers added a buffer for unexpected variables. The fleet would consist of 3 heavy cruisers for orbital bombardment, 6 assault transports for ground occupation, 2 support vessels for logistics, and 1 command ship for coordination. Overkill, the computers noted with digital disapproval, was inefficient and reflected poorly on strategic planning competence. The pre-invasion intelligence briefing painted a picture of a species so thoroughly distracted by trivial pursuits that they might not notice an invasion until the occupation was complete. Humans spent their time arguing about whether a particular sequence of musical notes constituted artistic expression or sonic torture, while simultaneously creating elaborate fictional narratives about their own eventual conquest by beings remarkably similar to the hegemony itself. The irony was noted in the official records, with the dry humor characteristic of military intelligence reports. The invasion timeline was established with clockwork precision: arrival at 0800, Earth Standard Time, ultimatum delivery at 0830, surrender acceptance at 0900, and full planetary occupation by 1200. The schedule allowed for a civilized lunch break before filing the conquest completion paperwork. The hegemony prided itself on maintaining proper administrative procedures, even during military operations. The first indication that this conquest might deviate from established protocols came exactly 37 minutes after the ultimatum broadcast. The hegemony had spent considerable resources perfecting their universal translation matrix, a masterpiece of linguistic analysis capable of rendering their demands comprehensible to any species with basic cognitive function. The message was clear, polite, and offered generous terms for immediate surrender, continued existence under benevolent hegemony guidance in exchange for complete submission. Humanity's response arrived with promptness that initially suggested compliance. The universal translators processed the incoming transmission with their usual efficiency, then promptly experienced what could only be described as a catastrophic logical failure. The phrase "come and take it" appeared to create a recursive loop in the translation algorithms, as if the concept itself was fundamentally incompatible with the linguistic framework of civilized discourse. The invasion fleet's communication specialists worked frantically to resolve the translation error while monitoring Earth's global networks for signs of the expected panic. Instead, they discovered something that challenged their understanding of rational behavior. Humans were placing monetary wagers on various aspects of the impending invasion. Betting pools had emerged covering everything from the duration of resistance to the probability of successful alien reproduction with terrestrial livestock. The most popular wager involved predictions about which human military unit would achieve the first confirmed alien casualty. The odds were being continuously updated across thousands of platforms, with passionate arguments erupting over the relative merits of various human combat formations. Some individuals were apparently mortgaging their dwellings to place larger bets, while others organized viewing parties with elaborate refreshment preparations. The Hegemony's behavioral analysts stared at their displays in bewilderment. According to every psychological profile in their extensive databases, primitive species confronted with overwhelming force should exhibit panic, despair, or desperate attempts at negotiation. Humans appeared to be treating the invasion as entertainment, complete with commentary tracks and promotional merchandise. Several entrepreneurs had already begun selling clothing items emblazoned with phrases like "My planet got invaded, and all I got was this lousy t-shirt." The invasion fleet commander reviewed the situation reports with growing confusion. In 47 previous conquests, the most unexpected response had been a ceremonial dance performed by a species of sentient crystalline beings before their formal surrender. No species had ever responded to invasion by organizing a fantasy sports league around the conflict's outcome. Perhaps most disturbing was the complete absence of governmental surrender negotiation. Instead of desperate pleas for mercy or attempts at diplomatic resolution, Earth's leadership appeared to be engaging in what humans called trash talk, elaborate verbal displays of anticipated violence against the invading force. The translations that did function properly revealed threats so creatively brutal that several Hegemony officers required psychological counseling after reading the transcript. The invasion was scheduled to commence in 12 hours, but for the first time in Hegemony military history, the war computers requested additional processing time to recalculate probability matrices. Apparently, the concept of a species that viewed overwhelming odds as a personal challenge, rather than a reason for surrender, had never been properly integrated into their strategic algorithm. The Hegemony's standard conquest protocol had been refined through centuries of successful implementation across dozens of worlds. Phase 1 involved the systematic elimination of planetary communication networks, followed by precision strikes against military installations, and concluded with the occupation of major population centers. The protocol had never failed, primarily because it was sensible, logical, and implemented by beings who understood that resistance against overwhelming force was mathematically futile. Humanity, it appeared, had never received the mathematical education necessary to appreciate futility. The first 72 hours proceeded exactly according to plan. Hegemony pulse weapons disabled Earth's satellite networks with surgical precision, leaving humans temporarily unable to share images of their breakfast or express opinions about the romantic relationships of people they had never met. Military bases across 6 continents received visits from Hegemony bombers, which reduced advanced human weapon systems to their component atoms with admirable efficiency. Major cities found themselves under the supervision of Hegemony occupation forces, who established control zones with the practiced competence of a species that had performed this routine 47 times previous. The invaders set up administrative centers, broadcast compliance instructions in the local languages, and began the standard 72-hour waiting period for formal surrender negotiations to commence. The surrender negotiations never came. Instead, on hour 73, humans began doing that peculiar thing they do when confronted with problems that should logically be impossible to solve. They got creative with spite-fueled determination that bordered on the physically impossible. The first indication of systematic resistance came when teenagers across the globe began using their primitive handheld communication devices to coordinate activities that the Hegemony's behavioral analysts initially dismissed as random youth gatherings. These gatherings, however, possessed an organizational structure that would have impressed military strategists if they had bothered to pay attention to children. Within hours, flash mobs, armed with homemade projectile weapons, were appearing at strategic locations with timing that suggested either supernatural prescience or a level of social coordination that challenged assumptions about human cognitive capacity. The Hegemony's artificial intelligence systems, which had successfully predicted the behavior of 47 previous species, began generating error reports at an alarming rate. Humans were employing tactical approaches that violated fundamental principles of warfare, such as using elderly individuals as reconnaissance assets, and converting recreational vehicle gatherings into mobile command centers. The AI's attempts to model human behavior kept returning results that suggested the species was simultaneously highly intelligent and completely insane. Perhaps most disturbing was humanity's apparent willingness to weaponize items that had never been designed for violence. The Hegemony's Equipment Requisition Department received increasingly frantic requests for protective gear against attacks involving kitchen utensils, gardening implements, and substances that humans normally use to preserve food. The invasion forces had come prepared for primitive chemical explosives and metallic projectiles, not for coordinated assaults by individuals wielding sharpened farming tools and containers of fermented organic matter. The turning point came when Earth's retirees began demonstrating organizational capabilities that put military logistics specialists to shame. Across the planet, individuals who spent their time cultivating decorative plants and complaining about the behavior of younger generations revealed themselves to be a distributed intelligence network with decades of experience in community organization and an alarming familiarity with improvised solutions to complex problems. Garden clubs, transformed into intelligence-gathering operations overnight. Weekly social gatherings became strategy sessions for guerrilla operations. The Hegemony's surveillance systems, designed to monitor military communications and governmental coordination, proved completely inadequate for tracking resistance activities coordinated through book clubs and neighborhood associations. The invaders found themselves fighting an enemy that communicated through channels they had never thought to monitor. The psychological warfare began on day 4, though the Hegemony's military psychologists initially failed to recognize it as warfare at all. Humans began engaging in coordinated activities that served no apparent tactical purpose, but seemed designed to create maximum confusion among the occupation forces. Groups of individuals would appear in public spaces and perform synchronized movements to rhythmic audio, while occupation soldiers watched in bewilderment. The Hegemony's Cultural Analysis Department worked frantically to decode these displays, convinced they represented some form of coded communication or ritual preparation for violence. The discovery that humans were simply expressing defiance through interpretive movement, while simultaneously broadcasting these activities across their primitive information networks, created a crisis in the military psychology division. Several analysts requested reassignment to less stressful duties, such as negotiating peace treaties with species that communicated entirely through explosive chemical emission. The invasion forces' communication networks began experiencing systematic interference that their technical specialists initially attributed to equipment malfunction. The interference followed a pattern that seemed almost musical, if music could be described as a repetitive audio sequence designed to induce psychological distress through relentless repetition. The technical term for this phenomenon, according to human cultural databases, was apparently something called being rickrolled, though the military significance of this designation remained unclear. The Hegemony's mental health support services, which had never been required during previous conquests, suddenly found themselves overwhelmed with requests for counseling. Occupation soldiers reported increasing levels of stress related to the unpredictable nature of human resistance. Traditional military training had prepared them for organized opposition from governmental forces or desperate civilian uprisings, not for elderly individuals offering them baked goods that might or might not contain psychoactive substances, while children followed them around asking questions about their reproductive biology. The invasion fleet commander reviewed the situation reports with growing frustration. Standard protocol called for a formal surrender ceremony to occur within 120 hours of initial contact, but Earth's governmental representatives seemed more interested in organizing what they called press conferences, where they made statements that the universal translators rendered as elaborate challenges to single combat. The military leadership appeared to be treating the invasion as an opportunity to test new weapons systems, rather than as a catastrophic defeat, requiring immediate capitulation. By the end of the first week, the Hegemony's war computers began requesting additional processing power to handle the increasingly complex behavioral modeling required to predict human action. The algorithms designed to calculate resistance probability had been overwhelmed by the sheer variety of creative responses to occupation. Humans were employing tactics that ranged from sophisticated electronic warfare conducted by individuals barely old enough to operate vehicles, to coordinated supply chain disruptions, organized by people whose primary qualification was an intimate knowledge of local retail operations. The most troubling development was the complete absence of despair among the human population. According to every psychological profile in the Hegemony's extensive databases, prolonged resistance against impossible odds should result in declining morale and eventual acceptance of defeat. Instead, humans appeared to be enjoying themselves. Resistance activities were being treated as social events, complete with refreshment sharing and competitive elements that involved keeping score of successful operations against occupation forces. The occupation commanders found themselves facing an enemy that violated fundamental assumptions about rational behavior. Humans were not fighting to survive, they were fighting because the alternative was personally offensive to them. The difference, while subtle, was proving catastrophic to Hegemony's strategic planning algorithms that had never encountered a species that took military defeat as a personal insult, rather than an unavoidable reality. The Hegemony's military doctrine included provisions for dealing with stubborn species, though these protocols had been gathering metaphorical dust in the archives for several millennia. The stubborn species protocol represented the accumulated wisdom of encounters with civilizations that required more than the standard 72-hour pacification period. It had never actually been implemented, partly because truly stubborn species were rare, and partly because the protocol's authors had assumed that any species sufficiently advanced to require such measures would at least follow basic rules of military engagement. Humans, as the Hegemony was discovering with increasing alarm, appeared to have never read the basic rules of military engagement, or if they had, they seemed to regard them as suggestions, rather than mandatory guidelines. The escalation order arrived on day 10, tripling the invasion fleet from 12 ships to 30. The additional forces included specialized units for siege warfare, psychological operations specialists, and a full xeno-sociology team, tasked with determining exactly what was wrong with human cognitive processes. The reinforcement fleet also brought the Hegemony's most advanced artificial intelligence systems, which had been programmed with the behavioral patterns of every known sentient species in the galaxy. The AI systems began experiencing what could only be described as digital nervous breakdowns within hours of analyzing human resistance patterns. Their attempts to model human behavior kept producing results that suggested the species was simultaneously exhibiting characteristics of advanced tactical thinking and complete disregard for personal survival. The contradiction was so fundamental that several AI units requested permission to undergo complete memory wipes, rather than continue processing the paradox. The escalation protocol's implementation revealed the first major flaw in Hegemony's strategic thinking. They had assumed that humans would respond to increased pressure by becoming more reasonable. Instead, humanity's response to the arrival of reinforcements was to escalate their own efforts in ways that challenged several laws of physics and most principles of common sense. The transformation began in what humans called garages, apparently spaces dedicated to storing wheeled transportation devices, but secretly functioning as research and development facilities for individuals with more enthusiasm than formal education. These improvised laboratories began producing solutions to military problems that made Hegemony technology look quaint by comparison. The invasion forces found themselves facing weapons systems, cobbled together from kitchen appliances and recreational equipment, that somehow managed to penetrate energy shields, designed to withstand antimatter bombardment. The underground workshops operated with a methodology that violated every principle of proper scientific procedure. Humans would apparently conceive of theoretical solutions to engineering problems, then immediately begin construction without bothering with safety testing, regulatory approval, or basic feasibility studies. The approach should have resulted in catastrophic failures and massive casualties among the inventors. Instead, it produced weapons systems that worked for reasons that Hegemony scientists couldn't explain and didn't want to investigate too closely. The hold my beer phenomenon became a particular source of concern for the occupation forces.
This appeared to be a ritual phrase humans uttered before attempting activities that rational beings would recognize as impossible. The phrase served as a warning that someone was about to attempt something that would either fail spectacularly or succeed in ways that challenged fundamental assumptions about reality. The failure rate was disturbingly low, while the success rate included achievements that required immediate updates to hegemony physics textbooks. Basement engineers began producing innovations that suggested humanity had been deliberately concealing their technological capabilities. Communication devices appeared that could penetrate hegemony jamming systems, using principles that shouldn't have worked according to established electromagnetic theory. Transportation systems emerged that achieved performance specifications through modifications that looked like they had been implemented by individuals with limited understanding of engineering and unlimited willingness to experiment with potentially explosive material. The most troubling development was humanity's apparent ability to reverse engineer hegemony technology using methods that involved significantly more violence than conventional technical analysis. Captured alien equipment would disappear into these improvised laboratories and reappear days later as components in devices that performed functions their original designers had never intended. The hegemony's intellectual property lawyers began filing copyright infringement complaints, though the legal department acknowledged that enforcing galactic patent law against a species actively shooting at them presented unusual procedural challenges. The psychological warfare escalated beyond interpretive dance and musical harassment to include activities that challenged the hegemony's understanding of rational behavior. Humans began organizing elaborate pranks against occupation forces that served no tactical purpose but seemed designed to maximize embarrassment among the invaders. The pranks required significant coordination and resources to implement, suggesting that humans were willing to invest considerable effort in activities whose only purpose was making their conquerors look foolish. The most sophisticated prank involved convincing an entire hegemony garrison that Earth's gravity was gradually increasing, accomplished through a series of subtle modifications to their equipment and environment that created the illusion of progressive weight gain. The deception required precise coordination among dozens of human civilians and resulted in the garrison requesting emergency medical evacuation for a condition that didn't exist. The revelation that they had been systematically deceived by individuals whose day jobs involved selling overpriced beverages and managing small retail establishments was deemed sufficiently humiliating to require classified status in official reports. The turning point came during the third week of occupation, when the hegemony's strategic analysts finally identified the fundamental error in their assessment of human psychology. The revelation emerged from a detailed analysis of intercepted human communications, which revealed a pattern of behavior that explained the species' seemingly irrational response to conquest. Humans, the analysts discovered, were not fighting to survive the invasion. They were fighting because losing was personally offensive to them on a level that transcended rational self-interest. The distinction was subtle but catastrophic to hegemony's strategic planning. Their algorithms had been designed to model species that fought for logical reasons, territorial defense, resource protection, or species survival. They had never encountered a civilization that treated military defeat as a personal insult, requiring immediate and disproportionate retaliation. The psychological profile that emerged from this analysis painted a picture of a species that had evolved to view any form of submission as fundamentally unacceptable. Humans appeared to possess an innate resistance to authority that made them constitutionally incapable of accepting conquest, regardless of the practical advantages of surrender. They would apparently prefer extinction to the embarrassment of admitting defeat, which created strategic complications that the hegemony's military doctrine had never addressed. The war computers, when presented with this behavioral model, immediately recalculated their conquest probability assessment. The revised estimates suggested that successful pacification of Earth would require either the complete extermination of the human species, or a level of resource commitment that exceeded the planet's strategic value by several orders of magnitude. The computers also noted that extermination would eliminate the primary reason for conquest, while extended occupation would likely result in the gradual corruption of hegemony forces, through exposure to human behavioral patterns. The invasion fleet commander reviewed these assessments, with the growing realization that the Hegemony had made a fundamental error in their approach to Earth. They had assumed they were conquering a primitive civilization. Instead, they had apparently declared war on a planet full of individuals who treated losing as a personal character flaw requiring immediate correction through increasingly creative applications of violence. The realization that humanity treated conquest as a personal affront rather than a military reality should have prompted an immediate strategic reassessment. Instead, the Hegemony's command structure spent 3 days arguing about whether their behavioral analysis could possibly be accurate. The concept of a species that would choose extinction over the mild embarrassment of surrender challenged fundamental assumptions about rational behavior that had guided galactic civilization for millennia. While the aliens debated the philosophical implications of human psychology, humanity was busy demonstrating that their capacity for taking things personally extended far beyond mere military defeat. The species that had once organized global conflicts over the proper pronunciation of religious terminology and the acceptable ingredients for traditional food preparations was now applying that same obsessive attention to detail toward the complete humiliation of their would-be conqueror. The counter-offensive began not with military fanfare or governmental proclamations, but with what humans called getting organized, a process that involved transforming every aspect of their chaotic society into a coordinated instrument of vindictive retaliation. The transformation occurred with the efficiency of a species that had spent centuries perfecting the art of holding grudges across multiple generations, while simultaneously maintaining detailed records of perceived slights for future reference. The first phase involved weaponizing humanity's greatest strategic advantage, their complete inability to mind their own business. The same social networks that had previously been used to share images of food and argue about the personal lives of entertainers suddenly became coordination systems for military operations that spanned continents. The Hegemony's intelligence analysts watched in horror as humans began sharing tactical information with the same enthusiasm they had previously reserved for celebrity gossip and pictures of small animals. The coordination efforts revealed capabilities that challenged every assumption about primitive civilization. Humans demonstrated an ability to organize complex logistical operations, using communication methods that the Hegemony's surveillance systems couldn't monitor, coordinate, or even identify. The resistance network operated through channels that included everything from organized sports leagues to religious gatherings, creating a command structure that was simultaneously everywhere and nowhere. The technological innovations that emerged from this coordinated effort suggested that humanity had been deliberately concealing their capabilities behind a facade of primitive entertainment and social dysfunction. Weapons systems appeared that incorporated principles the Hegemony's scientists had dismissed as theoretical impossibilities. Communication devices emerged that operated on frequencies that shouldn't have existed according to established physics. Transportation systems materialized that achieved performance specifications through modifications that looked like they had been implemented by individuals with unlimited creativity and a complete disregard for safety regulation. The most disturbing development was humanity's apparent ability to innovate under pressure in ways that violated several conservation laws and most principles of responsible engineering. The species that had previously focused their technological efforts on creating increasingly efficient methods of sharing trivial information suddenly began producing military hardware that made hegemony equipment look like primitive tools. The innovations emerged from improvised workshops operated by individuals whose primary qualifications appeared to be enthusiasm and access to discarded machinery. The Hegemony's evacuation began on day 28, though the official records would later describe it as a strategic repositioning in response to changing operational parameters. The reality was considerably less dignified, involving panicked retreat orders issued by commanders who had realized that continued occupation would likely result in their forces being systematically embarrassed by individuals whose previous military experience consisted entirely of recreational activities involving simulated combat.
The withdrawal process revealed the extent to which human resistance had penetrated every aspect of the occupation. Hegemony equipment began malfunctioning in ways that suggested systematic sabotage by individuals with intimate knowledge of alien technology and unlimited patience for implementing elaborate practical jokes. Supply lines that had operated flawlessly for 47 previous conquests suddenly began experiencing problems that ranged from mysterious delays to complete disappearance of cargo shipments. The most humiliating aspect of the evacuation was the complete absence of human pursuit. Rather than celebrating their victory through traditional demonstrations of military superiority, humans simply watched the alien withdrawal with expressions that suggested they were slightly disappointed by the ease of their success. The lack of triumphant celebration was somehow more insulting than active harassment would have been, implying that the Hegemony's forces had never represented a serious challenge worthy of significant effort. The after-action reports filed by Hegemony commanders made for sobering reading throughout the Galactic military establishment. The official recommendation was immediate reclassification of Earth from Class 7 primitive backwater to dangerous wildlife preserve, with a notation that the planet should be added to the official Do Not Disturb list, alongside plague worlds, dimensional anomaly, and systems containing unstable stellar phenomena. The psychological evaluation reports were even more disturbing, describing a species that appeared to be fundamentally incompatible with civilized conquest protocol. Humans demonstrated an ability to innovate, coordinate, and retaliate that suggested they had been deliberately concealing their capabilities behind elaborate displays of social dysfunction and trivial entertainment. The evaluators recommended that future contact with Earth be limited to long-range observation and strongly advised against any activities that might be interpreted as hostile by the inhabitants. 6 months after the evacuation, the galactic perspective on humanity had undergone a complete transformation. Earth's classification had been upgraded from primitive backwater to death world, with aggressive inhabitants, a designation previously reserved for planets where the ecosystem itself was actively hostile to visitors. The change reflected a growing understanding that humans were not primitive beings who happened to live on a dangerous planet, but rather dangerous beings who had learned to thrive in an environment that would kill most other species. The most significant development was humanity's unexpected invitation to participate in galactic peace negotiations, not as supplicants seeking protection or guidance, but as the people you called when you needed someone conquered and wanted them to stay conquered. The invitation reflected a pragmatic recognition that a species capable of defeating the Hegemony through pure vindictiveness might have valuable insights to offer regarding conflict resolution and deterrence strategy. The irony was not lost on the Galactic Diplomatic Corps that Earth had gone from being scheduled for routine conquest to being consulted on matters of interstellar security within the span of a single planetary rotation cycle. The transformation suggested that the universe's hierarchy might not be as stable as previously assumed, particularly when it encountered species that treated losing as a personal character flaw requiring immediate and disproportionate correction. The final entry in the official Hegemony records regarding Earth contained a simple notation that would influence galactic policy for generations. Recommendation: leave them alone. They take things personally, and they have very long memory. It was, perhaps, the most accurate assessment of human nature ever recorded by an alien civilization, and certainly the most practical advice ever issued by a military organization that had just discovered the hard way that some planets are better left unconquered.